he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And so Jesus said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides the women and children. This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Please be seated. I think we need to kind of see what leads up to this event, because in itself it's a very good story, but there's a lot of backstory going on behind it as well. The first thing I want us to remember is this, that we have 4 different gospel accounts. And usually those gospel accounts all have different stories in them. A couple of them might agree, but then the other 2 may not. Sometimes 3 of them agree, and then John usually is one that doesn't. But the feeding of the multitudes is the only story in all of the Gospels that are told. That if you look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you will find a story about feeding the multitudes. It is the only story told that all 4 Gospels record. So obviously this must be of some importance. If somebody remembered it and wrote it down, and another person remembered it and wrote it down, and you got 3 and 4 people that remembered it and wrote it down, and again, it wasn't always precisely the same words, so we know they weren't just copying one another. But there are 4 separate accounts of the same story. And in some of the gospel accounts, we get some of that backstory. For instance, in one of the Gospels, it says that before this, Jesus was in his hometown, and the people there would not believe in him. They basically looked at him and said, "Isn't this that snot-nosed little kid of Mary and Joseph's? Why should we listen to him?" And it is said that he could do no miracles there, for they did not believe. He healed some people, but then he basically left town. And the reason he left town, in one of the gospel accounts, it says they were trying to march him off. And what they were trying to do was take him up to a cliff so that they could dump him off. And yet, in that same gospel, it says he walked right through them and was gone. We also know that prior to this, in one of the gospel accounts, is when he sent out his disciples 2 by 2, so that he might send them into the world, so that they might take the Word of God with them, and not only the Word of God, but that they might heal and cast out demons in his name. It's at this point that we pick up our story this morning. The apostles had just come back. Jesus had been kicked out of his hometown, and now he hears that John the Baptist, his cousin, has been beheaded. To say it was a bad week, I'd say that was an understatement. I can almost imagine why he wanted to get in that boat. When you have that much of a load on you, it wears you down. Now, Jesus, of course, is God, but he is also at the same time human. And he understands our pain. He suffered the loss of his cousin. He has been physically and verbally abused. He knows what our bad days are like. And he was having one of those days. And so he wanted to get in the boat to just get away. He wanted to spend some time with his disciples to hear about all they had done, and then to use what he had heard from them to teach them further. He also was probably trying to put his head around all that had transpired through this past week or so. And yet, we heard that when he got to the other side, there was a multitude of people waiting for him. Now, Jesus could have been like some of us. Maybe when we're having a bad week, maybe when things aren't going exactly as we planned, and somebody wants us to visit with them, or somebody wants us to come to a certain occasion, or we know we have plans with someone. A lot of times, we then just say, you know what? I'm really sorry. It's been a bad week. Can we get a rain check? Or we might even go farther and just plain old make up an excuse. I'd like to be there, but I can't. I've lost a family member. I hope you understand. And I think the people probably would have. But Jesus does not look to use excuses. In fact, when Jesus looked at these people, it says that he had compassion for them. That he saw their needs and he knew how they ached. Because he had felt some of that himself. He knew what they were feeling like. And so his heart went out to them. And he knew he did not forsake them. And so he said, boys, let's bring it in to shore. We got work to do. And so he began to teach. He began to heal people. And that took most of the day. His disciples got a lot of freaked out going on because pretty soon it's after 3 o'clock. And they know that these people have not eaten most of the day, and it's about time for feeding around the area. There's not a whole lot around there. McDonald's still haven't been invented yet. And so the disciples say, Jesus, you got to let these people go because it's a long way back to towns so that they can get some food. If you let them go now, they can make it in time. And Jesus looks at them and says, no, they don't have to go. You feed them. Why would Jesus look at his disciples that calmly and say, you do? Well, I think one of the reasons is what we heard happened just prior to that. That Jesus sent them out teaching, healing, and casting out demons in his name. Now, don't you think that if you had been out in the world and you were able to heal people of real things that have been going on in their lives, and you were able to cast out demons, don't you think feeding 5,000 people might be light work after that? It's almost like they forgot what they had just seen happen with their own eyes, what they themselves had been part of. It was in the name of Jesus, but it was their hands. It was their feet. I would almost expect in their minds they could say, well, now that he's in our presence, we're even stronger. We can do this. And yet the opposite happens. They say, Jesus, come on, we don't have the money. There's no place around here to get food. What do you expect us to do? All we've got is 5 loaves and 2 fishes. We learned in one of the gospel accounts it wasn't even their 5 loaves. It was a little boy who happened to have them. And this little boy came forward and said, here, this is what I have. A child brings forward this food. It reminds me of a story that I heard. Actually, I read it online. I get a lot of emails, and I'm very grateful for them. people get stories that they think I need to read, and most of the time I really do need to read these stories. I'm very thankful when they come in. And a lot of times I file them away in the back of my mind, which is a very bad place to be sometimes, because it's just kind of just filled with things that, I don't know, it's hard to pull them up some days, but this story this morning at 4 o'clock just was resonating. It was a story about a food pantry and a worker there. They had just done a food drive at a local grade school. They asked the kids to bring in canned goods and box goods, and they wanted these elementary schools to have a contest to see who could raise or bring in the most food. And of course, they went in and explained to these students why it was that they were asking for food, that there were people in the community who didn't have enough to eat. And so as all of this food came in, they were back at their collection point, and they started emptying the trucks and with the bags and sorting through them, putting the cans in one spot, the boxes in the other, and just putting things where they belong. And one of the workers, who was been around for a long time, older gentleman, but kind of one of those veterans, not only of life but also of the war, he was sorting through, and as he was going through, when he reached in, he pulled out a brown paper bag. And he opened it and dumped it out. And there was a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, there was an orange, and there were some crackers. And on the bag, it simply said, Christie, room 104. And as he looked at that, and he looked at the bag, he realized that some little girl gave up her lunch, gave up her meal for that day at school so that others might be able to eat. Now, as big and as tough as this guy was, of course, tears started running down his face. And when a guy like that starts crying, people notice. And so they came over and said, what's going on? And so he simply showed them the bag and the contents of the bag. And they too started to understand. And pretty soon everybody that worked there heard and saw this. And of course, with our modern means of communication, they began to tell the story on Facebook and through emails, and a television station heard about the story and came and talked to this man who held onto this bag. Within 3 days, that food pantry received more money and more food than they had in the past 6 months. All because one little girl offered up her lunch so that others might be fed. There is power in what we do if we do it for God. That what little bit that we might have that we think is inconsequential, if we place it into God's hands, amazing things can happen. And the disciples, for some reason, missed that point. Even though they had just come back from doing all these amazing things, it was like they went back to first grade. They just forgot that if they trusted in God, who was standing right before them, then yes, when He said feed them, they could have fed them. But instead, they came up with excuses. Jesus, hey, middle of nowhere, no money, no food, send them home. And so Jesus does what He normally does. He takes what is there, what has been offered by this small child. He raises it up to heaven. He gives thanks to God for all that God provides. Because God always provides what we need. He doesn't always provide what we want, but He definitely provides what we need. Do you remember about 13 years ago in Pennsylvania, some coal miners were trapped in a coal mine. And they had to dig down very gingerly another tunnel to try and get to them. They were down there for 77 hours. And they would lower this cage into the ground and bring them up one by one. I remember watching it on television. Number one, I kept thinking I would not want to be in that cage. I'm not claustrophobic normally, but that would do it. Number two, I wouldn't want to be down in the ground where they were. And I was praying that each and every time that basket came up, that person was moving. But when that coal mine, when that collapsed, you have to understand the conditions inside. There was water running through there. That water is cold. Had they stayed in the water, they would have died of hypothermia. The temperatures will go down. Lower your body temperature enough, your organs shut down. Well, during that collapse, while they were scrambling, they managed to find a ledge that they all jumped up on. They were out of the water. They didn't know the ledge was there, just happened to be there. And as time progressed, they were looking at the water because they didn't have much else to do, and somebody noticed something and reached down, and there was a lunchbox. And in that lunchbox was a corned beef sandwich, a can of soda, and some chips. They have no idea whose it was or how it got there, but it was there. And for 77 hours, those miners lived on the contents of that lunchbox. Again, I'm sure they probably wanted more than that, but that's all they needed to sustain themselves until help came. God does indeed give us what we need, but not what we want. And that's a good thing. Because God truly knows that when we have our way, things usually go very bad. But if we trust in Him, even those things that seem so small will lift us up and sustain us. And if you think it's hard, it's not. I keep telling everybody that I meet that it's those little things that we do with a great deal of love that make all the difference. Vera was talking about going to the Emmaus Soup Kitchen. How she got involved was this. I've got a shirt, well, I got a bunch of shirt relatives. My dad was one of 16 kids. I got cousins all over the planet. And for some reason, Vera likes to Facebook all these people. I don't have a clue who half of them are. But one of them was a Shirtel relative, and she had been chatting to her, and somehow she mentioned she was going down to the Emmaus Soup Kitchen, and Vera asked why, what's going on. And the next thing I know, Vera says, hey, Monday from 2:30 to 6, you have to be in the store. And I said, sure, okay. You're the boss. I'll be there. And she went down to the soup kitchen. You see, in the summertime, as she was sharing, they have to rely on volunteers to serve because during the school year, the college students and the high school students will come in and serve the meals. So they always have plenty of hands. But during the summer, when everybody's on vacation, that's when there's nobody around. Sorry, guest speaker, by the way. And because nobody's around, they are always short-handed. And so Vera showed up. And she said the first night, I think they served about 160 people. And she said they hustled. They got somebody running trays back and forth, and you're dishing out, and you're doing certain things. And they always plan for a little bit extra. Because sometimes they'll even call after they've served people for seconds and have people come up. So even though they plan on about 160, they're probably prepped for about 175, maybe 200 at the most. Well, she talked to Eileen about it, and Eileen said, well, let me know the next time you're going, and I'll go with you. And so Vera did that. And then Eileen called her and said, well, Bill's going to take me because he wants to drop me off, and then he's going to do some errands. Well, when Bill got there, he found out just how short-handed they were. Bill didn't do any errands. He parked the car, and he came inside, and he helped out on the line. They were short-staffed so badly that not only with Eileen and Vera being there, Bill was actually the runner. He was the guy that was going back and forth, going into the kitchen, getting the stuff, bringing it out, so that they could serve to all those people. And they ran out of food. 287 people showed up that day. Well, they ran out of the food they prepared. But then they found something. One of our favorite foods of all time. They had hot dogs and other things. They fed all 287 people. They never skipped a beat. Even though they knew they didn't have enough of what they prepared, they knew that God would provide. They knew that these people that they wanted to feed, they trusted that God would give them the means to do it, and He did. And not only did God give them the means to feed these people, to feed their bellies, He also gave them the means to feed their souls. Because one of the things that you learn when you're there is that a smile goes a long way. Saying hello to someone is more precious to them than gold. You see, a lot of people that come into the city mission, nobody smiles at them. When they're on the street, people will rather look away than look at them. And if they do look at them, they look at them with scorn or pity. And they never talk to them. And certainly nobody ever welcomes them in. How much does it cost to smile? Nothing. But to someone who has no home, who has no friends, to paraphrase MasterCard, it's priceless. And it's something that we can all do. We can take what God has given us, all of our gifts, and just by extending ourselves a little bit, trusting that He will show us how and when we are able to best serve Him. If we just listen, God will give us that opportunity many times throughout our days. And sometimes it's going to be that tough. It's going to take us actually smiling at someone we might not normally smile at. It might take us to spend a little extra time with someone who can be a real pain in the backside, but they just might need you to be there for them. That's all it takes. And if we trust God with what we have, miracles do happen. But we have to believe. And yes, we might visually be able to see, just as I'm sure those people standing in line at the soup kitchen could see that the food was running low. Nobody panicked. They improvised. They just trusted. They knew that God had a plan B, and He probably had a plan C and a plan D. One of the other interesting things that Mary did tell me, out of those 287 people that came through to eat, 20 of them were children. Probably 30 to 40% of them were women. Usually when we think about a soup kitchen, we think about men who are, well, they're either on some sort of substance abuse or some other things, but some of these people can be our own neighbors for all we know. And the sad part is, maybe it's just because we don't care to know. Let's face it, we have been blessed to over-blessing. We have more than we could possibly ever need. If we would realize that, if we could trust in God enough, that we might start actually sacrificing, as that little girl did with her lunch, I'm not talking about trying to send thousands of dollars to some organization. I'm talking about just chipping away a little bit at a time. Day by day, doing something for someone else, but doing it to glorify God. I guarantee you will change the world. It will certainly change someone's life, and it will be for the better. So God is telling us all, you feed them. I'll take care of the miracles, but it's up to you to feed my children.